You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business leaders. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this series. And in today's conversation, we're going to discuss diversity, equity, inclusion, but particularly as it pertains to disability. Why should any conversation around diversity include disability? Why do employees hide disabilities? What are some of the best practices to create a culture of inclusion in the workplace? Joining me today is Ruth Rathblatt, author, speaker, CEO, consultant, expert on diversity and inclusion. Ruth, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Steve. I'm excited to be here.
So Ruth, just for our listeners, start out briefly and tell us a little bit about your career and about yourself and how you got into this whole subject area.
Sure. I have spent my career being an executive in the nonprofit space. And so most recently was a CEO that focused on getting kids to and through college. I focused on expanding and providing access to young people. That's how I've spent my career, is really thinking about young people. What do they need? And creating also at the same time, Steve, creating connection for employers and employees to be role models for young people. And so that's how this literally was my career and where I started. And that's been for over 25 years. And at one point during that career, I was in a conversation with several people about the concept of diversity. And I asked at one point if people saw me as diverse. And somebody answered back, "Yeah, you're a woman." And I said, "Yep, that's a lens of diversity. We often talk about race and we talk about gender, and maybe we put sexual orientation in there." And so I said, "Well, okay, what about my limb difference? What about my disability?" And the answer back was fascinating to me. It was an immediate, "Oh, well, we don't see you like that." And I thought, I don't necessarily I'm not asking to be seen like that. I'm asking for it to be acknowledged as part of diversity. It's part of what's made my experience me in terms of having one hand. And what it created for me was an opportunity to start to reach out to corporations and think about how are they defining diversity, what gets included and what doesn't get included. And so now I'm on this passion project around the idea of how do we expand the conversation around diversity to be fully inclusive.
Yeah, and you've just written a book about it called Single-Handedly, which is a really interesting title, given your hand. Talk about what led you to write this book. It's a great title and it's a great book talking about all of the subjects of diversity.
Sure. So for 25 years, I actually hid my hand. I hid it in my pocket. It started my freshman year of high school and lasted for 25 years. And the book is really this idea of what's the journey I took from hiding to learning to unhide, with the idea that so many of us are hiding parts of ourselves. And so I wanted to share, just have someone not have to make assumptions about what it's like to live with a disability or what it's like to hide, but to share with people those stories of where I hid and how I learned to unhide. And what I did first is I did a TEDx talk last fall, and that was called "When I Stopped Hiding, I Found Freedom." And what I realized is so many of the messages that people would write to me after the TEDx, they would say, "Wow, I never thought about disability like that. I never thought about diversity. I'm hiding part of myself." And the truth is, so many of us are hiding part of ourselves. Actually, there was a Deloitte study, Steve, in 2013 that said 61% of people are hiding part of themselves in the workplace. And so and actually what's even more interesting is that 20% of C-suite leaders, your audience, are hiding part of their disability. They're not comfortable talking about it. So as I started to explore kind of the reaction around disability, the reaction around diversity, this concept of hiding and unhiding, it was natural to write a book and share my story out so that it would help others and impact them.
It's a fascinating journey that you've been on, but, we as a country and as a society have been on this journey as well. I mean, if you dial back the clock, to when you and I started our careers, the whole Americans with Disability Act was, front and center. And, for decades now, we've been amending buildings, building codes for new buildings, but, going back and retrofitting buildings, every intersection for disabilities. But but then it kind of morphed into, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we kind of forgot the disability part, and I think what you brought back here is to say, hey, this is all part of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
100%, absolutely. And it's not just physical disabilities I'm talking about, those that are visible. I'm also talking about those that are invisible, like mental health or neurodiversity. And what I found, Steve, in that piece, because you're absolutely right, we've done a lot of work around it. And then at some point we kind of stopped. What I realized in writing the book is we can't do it single-handedly, which is why the name of it, I tried for so many years to do things on my own, try to figure things out, try to get things done by myself. And what I realized was that's not the answer. The answer is we need to connect with people. We need community. And that's what's driving most of us. We want that connection, but we can't do it alone.
Yeah. And so you're using your own visible disability to bring in the whole concept of the invisible disabilities. You're being very generous with this effort because, everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but, there are lots of issues that people have. And, what I hear you saying is that we all need to make space for each other. We all need to be sensitive to each other's, differences and needs, and think of all that as part of diversity.
Absolutely. And I would add on to that disability is truly intersectionality at its definition, because disability doesn't discriminate. You can be any race, you can be any age, you can be any gender, you can be born with a disability or acquire it at some point in your life, and most of us will. Or you could be a caretaker, Steve, to someone with a disability. So disability needs to come back into the conversation for it to feel truly inclusive.
It's interesting to me, and I know you're comfortable talking about this because we've talked about it, but you hid your hand. It's so interesting to me. And you started that, not, when you were a small child, but you started it sort of halfway through. Talk about what that process, talk about, what drove you to be, sensitive to that, and why did you hide it?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I share in the book, it started really for me as an impulsive decision I made going to a new high school. So many of us start new schools, we start new jobs, and we think, oh, am I going to fit into this space? Am I going to fit into the new school? Am I going to fit into the job? Am I going to make friends? Are people going to like me? And for me, that was that first day of going to a new co-ed high school, is I literally got on the bus and someone stared just a little too long, and it made me self-conscious. And that decision I made was supposed to be just for the bus ride to get to school. Like, oh, I'll just hide it so that I won't seem different. And then that decision for that bus ride lasted, I said, okay, just for the first day, I just want to make friends. I just want to fit in. I don't want to be different. And that ended up the first year. Then I went off to college and I thought, now I'm going to stop hiding, right? Because a lot of us do that. We say, oh, I'm going to start something new so people won't know me. I get to be a fresh self, a brand new self. And yet I went to college and I kept hiding. I didn't know how to stop hiding. I didn't know, because I had built an image and a story in my head that this was something that was something to be ashamed about and embarrassed about. And so, like most people who think there's something missing about themselves, they hide it. They want to fit in. And that's what I did. And so I think when I draw that out and the reactions I've gotten to the book and the TEDx, people say, me too. I hide, whether it's their accents, their just their religion, their family backgrounds, their education. People hide things all the time because we're so worried about, we fear the judgment that people are going to make. We fear rejection. So yeah, I think for me, hiding was that space of, I just want to fit in.
Yeah, that bus ride turned into a long journey.
That bus ride turned into a cross country and trip and beyond. Yeah.
And beyond. But it's interesting that it happened in school. Children can be so cruel, but as adults, we're just children with older skin. So that cruelty kind of gets buried a little bit. And, the whole thing that you talk about is the sense of wanting to belong and not wanting to be different. But you came to a different conclusion. You came to the conclusion that, in fact, differences are to be celebrated. Talk about that awakening.
Sure. And I would just piggyback on what you just said too, in terms of, I think it's normal adolescence, right? It's healthy development adolescence to want to fit in. That's part of what we've studied in Psychology 101. That's part of the hierarchy of needs and part of Erickson's stages of development. We want to fit in, we want to belong. And I will also just say that, yes, children can be tough and cruel, but they also can be curious, right? Sometimes children ask, and I appreciate when children ask because it's coming typically out of a place of kindness and curiosity. I may not have understood that as a child or a teen myself, but I think what we do, just if I can segue a little bit, is with kids, we give them the message that, I don't know how many times, and we've all been quote unquote guilty of it. When a child asks me about my hand, a parent immediately rushes over and says, shh, don't ask that. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry they asked you. No, kids are curious. We want to develop curiosity in kids. We want to keep them being curious. So that's a first thing, is we're saying, stop being curious. And the second is, we've sent a message now, we don't talk about disability. We don't ask questions. We don't talk about it. So now fast forward to us as adults, we've been ingrained with that message that disability is something we don't talk about. And so you're absolutely right. I have gotten to a place that my disability, my difference, is something that makes me unique. It's my gift. It's something that I'm able to share with others, and that they can start to then share parts of themselves where they have felt different. And so I also think, I will tell you, the people I always wanted on my team, Steve, and I am imagining, given how successful you are, you get it too, is the people I want on my team are those who have been through challenge, who've been forced to think outside the box, that come to me with the creative solutions, not the ones that just say, I don't think it's going to work. Okay, well, how did you think through that? How did you come to that? How do we think outside the box?
Yeah, it's those experiences that really make us, contribute in a group.
I've had to think outside the box my whole life, even to when I was 5 years old and most kids are learning to tie their shoe. I had to literally, my father sat down, tried to teach me to tie my shoe in the two-handed way. I don't have that. So I had to kind of bump him to the side and learn to figure it out on my own. How would I tie my shoe? And that model has been how I've gone through so much of my life.
So I have to ask you, what do you say when the children come up and ask the question? How do you answer it?
Yeah, first I thank them for asking, because I say, thank you so much for asking. This is something that I was born with. It's something that makes me different. And we all have differences. What are some of the things that make you different? How do you, what color are your eyes? Mine are different. Mine are blue. Yours are brown. Like, I start to point out, what are the differences that we all have? Because we all have them. Not one of us is we are all snowflakes in some ways. We all look different.
It is interesting. I have a grandson who has very white blonde hair, and he's subconscious about his hair. And, I can't understand why, but yesterday he saw an elderly gentleman with white hair walking down in front of his house. And he stopped his mother and he said, look, mother, look, mom, there's another person with white hair. Yeah. And, it's an interesting, out of the mouths of babes, you hear these things. But it really, what I really love about the way you approach it is, first of all, you make people comfortable, about asking, and you're so welcoming. And I'm not sure we all do that. I'm not sure we welcome the discussion about differences anymore.
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. And I would even say, I think that wherever someone is in in terms of their comfort around difference, we need to be okay with that, right? Because hiding and unhiding is a continuum. And so wherever someone shows up, be okay. Like, I happen to be one of those people who wants to be asked about it, because I'd rather that you not make an assumption about my ability or how it happened. I'd rather have you ask me about it. There are people, though, that don't want you to. And that's part of learning. But to your point, no one should be made to feel in trouble if they're asking out of curiosity and kindness. If they're asking as a way to support me, that's when it's okay, right? Like, if we're thinking about it, just even terminology. I mean, you and I talked a little bit offline too about the idea of the concept of disability. What do I call it? It's a limb difference. I didn't even know that term until I met someone who taught me that term. I always said I was missing my left hand, my little hand, but it's a limb difference. And it's actually called amniotic band syndrome, if I really wanted to get technical. But it's a disability. It has prevented me from doing some things in my life. It's something that's different about me.
And it's enabled you to do other things in your life, like talk about it and make a difference in the world.
Absolutely. And I think even with the word disability, Steve, it's almost part of the reason we stopped talking about it is because we kept defining it as something negative.
Right.
Disability, let's change and reframe it to be something strength-based and powerful. Because when we've had to not just be challenged by something, but when we've lived with something, it is a gift. It's the way that we see the world differently.
We've talked a little bit about the history of inclusion efforts regarding disability and why it should be included in the conversations about DEI. Next, we'll talk about what companies can do about it. We'll take a short break and be right back.
As you and your company monitor the volatile and uncertain economy, the award-winning forecast team at the Conference Board predicts a downturn by the end of 2022. Recession will further compound the crises that have recently upended expectations, from a deadly pandemic to a war in Ukraine and the highest inflation in decades. Yet, unprecedented crises also present unforeseen opportunities if you have a trusted, proven navigator by your side. With that in mind, and as the Conference Board has always done, we are providing you with daily, timely, and relevant content that will guide the business community through the economic storm. These trusted insights are being gathered on our website and are available to help your company master the challenges. To find out how you can chart a course for the future which will allow your business to emerge stronger on the other side, visit our free economic hub entitled Navigating the Economic Storm, your indispensable guide through the global recession, located at conference-board.org/topics/recession.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by author, fellow CEO, Ruth Rathblatt. Okay, so Ruth, past studies have shown, as you said earlier, that greater than 60% of employees hide their disability in the workplace. When you hear that, what kind of disabilities are we talking about? What's being hidden, and why are they doing this?
Sure. So many of us are hiding parts of ourselves. And so when I think about disability, I think about the visible, like mine, and I think about the invisible, the mental health that people are challenged with, the neurodiversity that people have been, quote unquote, diagnosed with. And so then when we think about that, people aren't necessarily sharing that piece of themselves because, again, they fear judgment. Like, I can't do the job. I won't be able to. Somebody will think I not just can't do the job, but that I'll have to have special accommodations made, or I'll be considered high maintenance. It's funny, Steve, I spoke with a woman not too long ago, and it was on a different subject altogether. It was about working with veterans and thinking about that area of my business. And she said, "Were you the one that put that poll out about hiding on LinkedIn?" I said, "Yeah," because I was trying to challenge that 61% from Deloitte from 2013, because I think the number's higher. And she said, "I answered no to that." And I said, "Okay, good." I said, "I noticed, but why did you answer no?" She's like, "Well, no, more importantly, as I'm talking to you, I realize I'm hiding." And I said, "Well, what are you hiding?" She said, "Two things." She said, "The first is I was hired during this Zoom world that we have, and people don't know that I can't walk, I'm immobile. So I'm scared to go back to work because I'm afraid of people making a judgment about what I'm able to do, what I can do, what I can't do. And even to the fact that they won't include me in team outings or after work events because they'll think, oh, well, we can't do that because she can't come. So I don't want to tell anyone. And the second thing she told me is, and I'm hiding the fact that my child has severe mental health challenges. I said, well, why are you hiding that? She said, because we make assumptions. We do two things with children is we make assumptions that if I'm a mom, I can't control my child when they have an outburst. And we've all done it. We've been in a supermarket, a child's melting down. And we're like, oh, can't they control their child? Or the worst, on an airplane. And she said, but I can, but my child has challenges and I manage them. So sometimes my video is off and my microphone is off at work so that people don't see that because I don't want them to know. She said, and I have to take my child to a lot of medical appointments. And she said, and I'm afraid of telling anyone at work about my child because they'll think she doesn't want it. She is not really committed to the job. She's worried about her child and the medical appointments. She can't do both. She's like, I can do both. And it's been proven during COVID, I've been successful at my job and I've been able to manage my disability as well as my child's. And so I share that because, again, sometimes we see things and we make assumptions about what we see, but there may be other things going on in people's lives. And I think COVID has allowed for us to kind of hide behind the camera.
Yeah, no, as well, it's really true. So in that vein, you've written about 5 mistakes that companies make around inclusion in the workplace. Talk about these mistakes and what they should do differently.
Sure. I think the first big mistake that we make is we assume that everyone's journey is the same around diversity. So if you are Black, your journey is the same if you're Black. If you have a disability, your journey is the same. If you're a woman, it's the same. And so what I talk about is how do we encourage employees to reflect and understand what their journey is before they can really understand other people's. So think about what you bring to the table. What is your personal journey? How do you start to share that out? And that is truly the power of employee resource groups. It's a place to start to share out the differences, but also the shared experiences. The second mistake I think that companies can make is that they can restrict the conversations on diversity to certain times of the month. So perfect example, we're in October. October happens to be National Disability Employment Awareness Month. We can celebrate disability all year long. It doesn't just have to be a month. It's great to bring attention to it, but how are we spending the other 11 months thinking about disability? How are we spending the other months thinking about, each group has kind of a month. Well, how are we thinking about that throughout the year? Because it's not just one month. Third, how do we think about representation? Because a lot of companies make policies and decisions without necessarily thinking about the people that they're affecting, right? We make decisions about, I'm just thinking, sometimes people who have a vested interest in the policy that we're making don't necessarily have a seat at the table. So I advise companies to think about who's represented when you're making decisions and who's not. A perfect small example of this is Mattel was creating the first Barbie that had a prosthetic. And the designers were all there and they were excited because it's part of diversity and inclusion to think about dolls in a different way. And they invited a young girl in Jordan Reeves, who had created and see if you haven't seen her, she's amazing. She created a prosthetic arm that shot glitter. So young kid, 10 years old, really adventurous and innovative. And so they invited her in to watch as they created this Barbie with a prosthetic leg. And as she's sitting there listening, she said, I'm just wondering, I have a question. They're being nice. And they said, oh, what's the question? She said, why is the prosthetic leg attached to Barbie? Like, why is it permanently attached? And they said, well, that's the way we're doing it. So, well, your prosthetic would never be permanently attached to you. It would always be something you could take off and remove. And it was a brain moment for them, right? Because they had all these smart designers around the table, but it took someone who actually used the product to know, wow. So thinking about who's at the table with you, who, when you're making decisions, whose voices are heard and whose are not heard. The fourth is measuring certain parts of diversity. We often focus, as we've talked about, on race and gender. And so there are companies out there who announce on LinkedIn and different platforms their goals around diversity. And it often focuses on those two key areas. Where's disability in the conversation? How are we thinking about that piece of it? Because we all know if we don't count it, and I should actually say, if we don't measure it, we don't count it. So if we're not finding those statistics or setting those goals around a certain area, it sends a message that it's not important, but it also means that we're not striving to get there. We're not striving there to get there in our recruitment, in terms of talent. We're not thinking about retention. So it's important. They're important to really start to look at what are the messages we're sending out about aspects of diversity. And then the last one is I talked a little bit with you about the power of employee resource groups. They are super powerful because they bring people together to share their experiences. They also bring people together to raise awareness and to educate and to think about advocating for policy. And in some companies, they restrict those groups to certain areas, whether it be, again, race and gender and maybe sexual orientation. And sometimes disability gets left out because they say, well, people won't want to join, or we have a really hard time recruiting for that because people don't want to associate with disability. I ask companies to think about how are they thinking about the ERG groups and how are they lending both executive support, because that's super important to the success of an ERG, and how are they adding budget, because there's a piece to how do you bring in speakers, how do you develop programs and workshops so that ERGs can flourish and the company culture can make people and allow people to really belong.
Yeah, so those are really interesting. You went through all five, and those are really interesting gaps. I'm not sure people would have thought about them if you hadn't raised them. And you've come up with some really interesting suggestions. Any other suggestions? DEI is such a huge topic. Every company, every community is talking about it. Any other things that you would recommend companies should be doing?
You're absolutely right. Companies are talking about it. They're prioritizing it. I think there was a statistic at one point, 90% of companies are prioritizing DEI efforts across the board. I will add in, only 4% of those actually mention disability as part of their platforms. So I would say recognizing that is going to be one key piece, because again, disability is not just visible. It's not just visible, it's invisible as well. It's actually, Steve, the largest minority group. And so when I talk to companies and I consult with them, I talk about kind of three places to start. One is start measuring pieces around DEI, start looking at disability as a piece of it. Second, start to think about diversity as the entire talent life cycle, not just how many people can we get in the door that look diverse, but actually how do we keep them? How do we exit with them? How do we, as our brand, embody them? How do we think about embodying diversity? And then the last piece I talk to companies about is the idea of accessibility. How do we make things accessible for all? And that's part of the talent life cycle too, from the ease of the application in terms of getting in, thinking about different types of disability, and also thinking about accommodations as part of accessibility. That how do we create it so it's not stigmatizing, but it's actually something that people can feel free to ask for and not feel like they're going to be judged or they're going to get in trouble or be seen as high maintenance. So I think if we measure it, we think about the entire talent life cycle and prioritize our goals around that. And then we think about creating that accessible workplace. That's when we create a place where people feel valued, where they feel like they belong, where they feel seen and heard. And those are the employees and truthfully, the leaders who want to stay.
Wow, those are really great words of wisdom. Ruth, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Steve, for having me. And thanks for amplifying the message as well.
Amen. And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover leading topics in economics, public policy, human capital, ESG, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues and your friends and your family. I know everyone's going to want to listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Conference Board, the indispensable ally that has helped businesses through war, recession, and economic transformation for over 100 years. As recent unexpected economic challenges persist, you can chart a course for the future which will allow your business to emerge stronger on the other side. Just visit our free economic hub entitled Navigating the Economic Storm, your indispensable guide through the global recession, located at www.conference-board.org/topics/recession.